Chapter 1. I stayed awake all night, and even as dawn broke, Daniel Miller still hadn't returned. Daniel Miller, Olivia Wilde, and I were high school classmates. For as long as I've known Daniel Miller, Olivia Wilde had secretly been in love with him. After the college entrance exams, Daniel Miller confessed his feelings to me and rejected Olivia Wilde's confession. When we started college, Daniel and I were in a long-distance relationship, while Olivia Wilde attended the same university and shared the same major with him. This weekend, during the charity clinic, I arrived only to discover Olivia Wilde was also there, but I didn't get a chance to be alone with her. Rest assured, dear classmate Emily Carter. I complained that he didn't need to report everything, yet at the same time, I felt incredibly reassured by his actions. When did things start to change? Perhaps it was after graduation, when we both started working. We interned at the same hospital, he in the internal medicine department, and I in the surgical department. Meanwhile, Olivia Wilde's father was the hospital director. At first, I didn't think much of it. Until one time, when I went to the hospital to have lunch with Daniel Miller, and Olivia Wilde was there too. Since we were all classmates, I placed a shrimp onto Olivia Wilde's plate, only for Daniel Miller to casually take that shrimp and place it onto his own plate right in front of me. I froze, my breath catching for a moment. In the end, Olivia Wilde was the first to react. She looked at me calmly and said, "I'm allergic to shrimp." At home, Daniel Miller also explained to me that earlier, during the colleague gathering at the hospital, Olivia Wilde mentioned she was allergic to shrimp. He hugged me from behind, his lips tenderly brushing against my ear. "Now that we're both working at the same hospital, and her father is the director, we can't afford to offend her. Emily, please understand me, okay?" I lowered my head, taking quite a while before softly replying with a faint okay. For Daniel Miller's birthday, I booked a restaurant, planning to celebrate with him. He told me his colleagues at the hospital were throwing him a birthday party and asked me to join. When I arrived, I discovered Olivia Wilde was there as well. From start to finish, I sat in a corner like an outsider, while he and Olivia Wilde sat in the middle of the crowd. Anyone looking at them would think they were the real couple. At home, perhaps noticing my unhappiness, Daniel Miller rubbed his forehead and said helplessly, "Emily, don't overthink it. Olivia Wilde and I are truly just friends." After graduation, he and Olivia Wilde were practically together every day, so frequent interactions were inevitable. But my feminine intuition told me that things between them weren't as simple as he claimed. Ever since high school, she had always wanted to compete with me in everything. Her grades couldn't surpass mine, nor could her looks, but she had the advantage of having a father who was the hospital director. Her innate privilege always made her shine brighter than me, her lively personality and boldness only added to it. During the school's sports meet, in the four-person relay race, Daniel Miller was tripped by an opponent and fell, scraping his knee and straining a ligament. Olivia Wilde grabbed the person who tripped him and said, "Teacher, he violated the rules. This race shouldn't count." Meanwhile, all I could do was quietly help Daniel Miller treat his wound. Then, she mustered all her courage to confess her feelings to Daniel Miller, who she had pursued for 6 years without hesitation. If she hadn't been the one to ruin my relationship, I might have found her honesty and boldness admirable. Emily, if there was ever something between Olivia Wilde and me, it would have happened a long time ago. We've been together for 6 years, we need to trust each other more, okay? Daniel Miller's eyes, aside from showing helplessness, carried a hint of disdain. In that moment, I realized how powerless I truly was. Pretending not to know meant watching him, step by step, slowly and subtly move closer to Olivia Wilde. Addressing everything openly would only push him further away. Moving forward or stepping back, either way felt like a dead end for me. When Daniel Miller went on a business trip, I wrote about everything that had happened between us and posted it to my social media. When Daniel Miller returned, he didn't say a word to me but packed up my belongings and left them in the hallway. After living together for 3 years, the night I suggested breaking up, he packed my things immediately and forced me to leave. Clutching the handle of my suitcase tightly, I looked up at him. "Why?" He took a deep breath, his tone carrying a hint of frustration. We've already broken up, so why do something like this? Let's part ways peacefully. Delete that post. I smirked, looking at him. I won't delete it. Daniel Miller paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was more serious. Emily Carter, you're a woman. The three of us are all classmates, and Olivia Wilde hasn't done anything wrong to you. Besides, making a scene out of this won't do you any good. Emily Carter, Olivia Wilde, their roles in his life were clear as day. My heart ached, my fingertips trembled, and I let out a cold laugh. She has done nothing wrong to me, but what about you? Olivia Wilde isn't afraid of being the other woman, so why should I be scared? Emily Carter. Daniel Miller's eyes glared at me, filled with anger and disappointment. Since when did you become like this? He turned around, and with a loud bang, the door slammed shut in my face. Standing in the empty hallway, I bit my lip hard, refusing to let the tears fall. I wanted to leave with more dignity. Leaving his house, I dragged my suitcase to the side of the road. When I received a call from my mother, I broke down in tears. My mother, who had endured a lifetime of hardships, only wished for me to avoid her fate. When she learned that Daniel Miller and I had called off our engagement, she simply urged me to love myself more, to find someone who would cherish and truly love me. Chapter 2. When I first started university, I had to juggle a part-time job along with my busy academic schedule. Every day was exhausting, and I would fall asleep as soon as I returned to the dormitory. One heavy rain left me with a severe cold. One evening, after finishing an elective class, I stepped outside and saw Daniel Miller standing under the street lamp in front of the laboratory building. He was wearing a white shirt, and with a look full of affection, he walked over and hugged me tightly. In the days that followed, Daniel Miller was always by my side. He accompanied me to classes, went with me to get injections and take medicine, and stayed until I fully recovered from my cold before reluctantly leaving. There were many moments like that. Later, through his close friend Jack Thompson, I learned that after returning home, Daniel Miller also caught a severe cold. But at that time, the person by his side was Olivia Wilde, not me. Perhaps I had been with him for so long that I took it for granted. It wasn't until he left that I realized there was such a huge void in my life. It felt like no one else could fill that space except for him. After a few days of feeling down, my best friend, Sophia Watson, came to me and asked, "Did you and Daniel Miller break up?" I forced a smile and looked at her. "Why do you ask?" Olivia Wilde posted something on her social feed. Did you see it? I was a little surprised and opened the social feed. What caught my eye was an intimate photo. In a romantic cafe, Olivia Wilde was holding a large bouquet of roses, smiling brightly as she leaned against Daniel Miller's shoulder. Daniel Miller and Olivia posed with their hands forming a heart shape. His gaze toward her was filled with intense affection. The caption read, "I've waited 6 years for this day." Daniel Miller immediately commented below, "From now on, I won't make you wait anymore." Sophia Watson comforted me, saying that Daniel Miller chose to break up with me for 2 reasons, either because he spent every day with Olivia Wilde and developed feelings for her, or because her father could help him in his career. I tried my best to hold back my tears, but they still blurred my vision. Amidst the flood of congratulatory comments, I noticed someone I hadn't seen in a long time appear. Ethan Page, applause. He always showed up in front of me with an amused, carefree attitude, and this time was no different. When I transferred to this high school, I heard from friends that Ethan Page was the most outstanding student in the school, not only the most handsome but also the top performer academically. The first time I saw him, I felt motivated to catch up to him. I even thought that if I studied hard enough, if I could surpass him just once, I might be able to catch his attention. But no matter how hard I tried, I always remained firmly in second place behind him. Ethan Page excelled and got into Peking University, while I chose a school nearby. After the college entrance exams, I mustered all my courage and wrote Ethan Page a love letter, confessing my feelings. But no matter how long I waited, I never received a response. My heart sank, and I gave up on my dreams, despite the ambiguous moments in the past that had once made me believe he might feel something for me too. That day, I walked in the rain, and Daniel Miller followed me, confessing his feelings. When I turned around and hugged him, I told him I was willing to be with him. On graduation day, he traveled a long way to see me, borrowing my graduation gown to take photos with me on the lawn. Nearby, there were two students taking wedding photos. Daniel and I stood silently watching for a moment before he suddenly turned to me and said, "Emily, when we get married, let's not only take photos at your school, but also at mine, okay?" I smiled at him and nodded enthusiastically. I never expected things would end up like this. When I came back to my senses, besides Ethan Page's applause emoji, I noticed Sophia Watson had left a melon-eating emoji in the comments as well. Looking at the comments, I, the protagonist of this drama, also left a congratulatory emoji. It was both mockery and closure. Perhaps because of my comment, not long after, Olivia Wilde deleted that post. A week later, my mother, worried about me, came to visit. When she saw me, her eyes were red, and she pulled me into her arms, sorrowfully saying, "Emily, don't worry, I'm here for you." Nearly half a month had passed since I broke up with Daniel Miller. I had lost a lot of weight, which naturally made my mother even more concerned. My parents divorced when I was in high school. Before I entered college, I once asked my mother why she had divorced my father. She said that on my father's birthday, she had prepared a table full of his favorite dishes, but he simply said, "I have plans with friends," and left her and the meal behind. Although Daniel Miller and I weren't exactly like my parents, between the three of us, Daniel, Olivia Wilde, and me, Olivia loved him more than I did. In Olivia Wilde, I saw a reflection of my mother from years ago. With half a month left until the Lunar New Year, I requested leave from work and went back to my hometown with my mother. During my time at home, every morning I woke up to delicious meals, and after eating, I could take leisurely walks with my mother. Rather than saying I had let go of my feelings for Daniel Miller, it would be more accurate to say I chose to avoid them, deliberately leaving myself empty and not thinking about anything. I wanted time to heal the wounds Daniel Miller had inflicted on me. Just a few days before the new year, Sophia Watson suddenly showed up at my house, announcing that this year's class reunion would be held on the 29th of the lunar month. "I heard Ethan Page is coming back from Beijing this year, and he'll be attending too," Sophia said with excitement. "If it weren't for Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde, I would definitely go meet the legend of our school. I wonder what he looks like now." Hearing his name, I couldn't help but feel excited about the reunion. "Let's go together," I said. Sophia looked at me in surprise. "Aren't you afraid of running into them?" "If the ones who cheated aren't afraid, why should I be?" Sophia seemed intrigued and rummaged through my closet, helping me pick out clothes and lipstick, insisting I must outshine Olivia Wilde. But on the day of the reunion, I only wore light makeup and a simple white dress. As I pushed the door open and stepped into the room, I immediately noticed Ethan Page. He was sitting in the corner of the room, under the light, his sharp facial features even more defined. Golden-rimmed glasses rested on his high nose bridge, his thin lips slightly pursed as he focused on his phone. When Sophia Watson and I entered, everyone cheered. It had been 6 years, and this was the first time I attended a class reunion. Ethan Page lifted his head to look toward the door, his gaze stopping on my face, and he smiled, nodding in greeting. Being late, Sophia Watson and I sat at Ethan Page's table, where 2 empty seats remained, likely reserved for Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde. After the food was served, the two of them arrived, leisurely late. I watched them walk in hand, saw Daniel Miller attentively pull out a chair and hang Olivia Wilde's coat, noticed her flawless makeup and striking red dress. Her radiant happiness was unmistakable, instantly making her the center of attention at the reunion. My heart felt as if it were being squeezed, a sharp pain spreading to the tips of my fingers. I had overestimated myself, clenching my hands tightly to hide my feelings of inadequacy. Daniel Miller's best friend, Jack Thompson, and a few others cheered as they saw the two of them. Olivia Wilde looked straight at me and smiled. "Hi, Emily Carter, long time no see. I hadn't expected her to act so nonchalantly, as if she wasn't the one who had deliberately ignored my existence, pursued Daniel Miller for 6 years, and even willingly played the role of the other woman. Sophia Watson, sitting beside me, retorted sarcastically, "It really has been a long time. Haven't had the chance to congratulate you, 6 years of chasing finally paid off." "What do you mean by that?" Before Olivia Wilde could respond, Jack Thompson angrily interjected. Daniel Miller always prioritized Emily Carter above all else. Olivia Wilde, on the other hand, spent 6 years putting Daniel Miller first. When Daniel Miller was sick, it was Olivia Wilde who took care of him. "And Emily Carter, where were you?" As he said this, he deliberately glanced at me. I knew they had gone to the same university, and Jack Thompson had liked Olivia Wilde since high school. Naturally, he would defend her against any criticism. I gave a faint smile, finding the situation utterly absurd. There was a time when I fell ill, and Daniel Miller had taken a few days off to care for me. Olivia Wilde had also taken leave under the guise of visiting an old friend like me, but was actually there to be close to Daniel Miller. Jack Thompson had even called me directly, questioning whether I knew they had exams coming up the following month. "Being with Daniel Miller, you'll always just be a burden to him." "Emily Carter, how could someone like you ever compare to Olivia Wilde?" Returning from my thoughts, I saw that Daniel Miller was now seated beside Olivia Wilde. He poured orange juice for her, then gently asked what she wanted to eat, busy and attentive, just like how he used to be with me. Olivia Wilde looked up and gave me a glance. It was full of flaunting, smugness, and even a hint of challenge. I knew she did it on purpose. 6 years later, she had finally won. Sophia Watson noticed and stood up, holding a full glass of wine as she approached. "Olivia Wilde, here's a toast to you. After all, these past 6 years haven't been easy for you. Stealing someone else's boyfriend isn't simple. If the other person didn't let go, it probably wouldn't have been your turn." "Sophia Watson, I don't understand what you mean." "Daniel Miller and I." Before she could finish, Sophia Watson interrupted, "Don't tell me you and Daniel Miller got together only after they broke up. That Valentine's photo you posted, the person with you was Daniel Miller. Your first Valentine's Day together? Don't tell me you didn't know they were supposed to get engaged on June 9th. Olivia Wilde was rendered speechless by Sophia Watson, lowering her head. Daniel Miller stood up, took the glass of wine from Sophia Watson, downed it in one gulp, and frowned as he looked at me. "Emily Carter, I've told you before, I broke up with you, and..." Daniel Miller continued, his expression firm, "Olivia Wilde has nothing to do with this. If you have a problem, take it out on me, but don't target Olivia Wilde." The noisy atmosphere suddenly fell silent. All eyes turned to me, the dazzling lights making me feel awkward. A sharp pain and bitterness surged within me as I bit my lip, trying hard to hold back my tears. Amidst the silence, the sound of a chair scraping the floor echoed as Ethan Page stood up. He slipped his phone into his pocket and said, "It's stifling in here. I'm going out for some air." As he passed by me, he paused and asked, "Care to join me?" Chapter 3. Like finding a lifeline, I quickly stood up and followed him. Leaving the room, we walked along the hallway until we reached the rooftop. The sky had turned pitch black. Ethan Page suddenly stopped, and I, not paying attention, nearly bumped into his back. "If you want to cry, just cry." "There's no one here," Ethan Page said, pulling out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, taking one, and looking at me. I shook my head and took a cigarette from his hand. Earlier in the room, Olivia Wilde blatantly lied, and Daniel Miller chose to lie to protect her. It was my first time smoking, and I choked, tears streaming down my face. Using the excuse of the smoke, I couldn't hold back anymore. Tears poured out uncontrollably, and I could only use the smoke to hide my miserable state. I didn't want to lose the only pride I had left in front of him after 6 years apart, meeting again for the first time. Ethan Page said nothing, merely handing me a tissue when I was exhausted from crying. "I saw your post." I was startled. "Although you didn't name yourself, everyone who knows you could tell you were talking about yourself. I stubbed out the cigarette after just one puff, smiling at him. Back in high school, in order to surpass him, I relentlessly studied, even sitting under the shade of the trees by the soccer field during gym class to read. Once, I was so engrossed that I didn't notice a sudden thud. I was hit by a soccer ball kicked by Ethan Page. He ran over to rub my head. "You're already not very pretty. What will you do if your head gets damaged?" "Then marry me," I blurted out, not knowing where I got the courage. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. His teammates burst into laughter as they watched us. Ethan Page lightly tapped my head, pulling me back to reality. "You're already 24 years old, so why is it that you've only grown in age, but not in maturity?" He stubbed out the cigarette in his hand and looked at me. If it were me, after going through the trouble of writing a post like that, when they show off, I'd directly call them out in the comments. Seeing him angry, it felt as though all my grievances melted away. When I stayed silent, his tone turned mocking. "Are you still hung up on it?" At some point, Ethan Page had moved very close to me. I looked at him. This was the first time we'd been this near to one another. His eyes were clear, a light brown as if freshly washed. Perhaps it was an illusion brought on by my tears, but I thought I saw a hint of confusion in his gaze. My face flushed bright red. I didn't call her out because I was embarrassed. I turned to look at the scenery outside the rooftop. I didn't want people to think that I'm inferior to Olivia Wilde in every way, that I don't even have the courage to confront her, and that all I can do is quietly express my grievances. Whether it's her background or her natural confidence, I can't compare to her. Other than academics, I lose to her in every aspect. It might seem childish, even laughable, but that's the deepest truth in my heart. Ethan Page pulled me close and gently embraced me, as though comforting a child. "Not as good as Olivia Wilde in everything? Are you putting her on too high a pedestal, or are you underestimating yourself too much? Is it all just because Daniel Miller chose her?" I let him hold me, and in that moment, all my pain faded away. Ethan Page released me, turned, and began to walk away. "Emily Carter, why would you choose someone as awful as that?" I didn't understand why he said that. After all, he was the one who rejected me before. I'm afraid of being rejected, but I'm also afraid of rejecting others. The bravest thing I've ever done, besides directly asking Ethan Page to marry me, was writing a love letter and asking a teammate to deliver it to him. I never expected him to completely ignore it, to be so heartless. Thinking of this made me angry. I didn't choose him. Should I have chosen you instead? Ethan Page adjusted his glasses and leaned down close to me. "Choose me, then? Am I really worse than your cheating fiancé?" His voice was full of sarcasm. My eyes stung, but I ignored the somewhat ambiguous posture between us, turned my head, and walked away. Ethan Page didn't follow. I stood in front of the door, took a deep breath, and tried to calm my emotions. Just as I was about to push the door open, it suddenly opened from the inside. Daniel Miller stood at the doorway. His gaze lingered on my face for a moment, then shifted behind me. His expression darkened instantly. Moments later, Ethan Page, who had somehow followed me upstairs, appeared. Daniel Miller suddenly spoke. So, Ethan Page managed to stay in Beijing for 6 years without issue, and this year he suddenly returns. "Emily Carter, every year I ask you to attend reunions with me, and you always refuse. But this year Ethan Page comes back, and you happily show up. Have the two of you been scheming together all along? What right do you have to blame me?" From his words, I picked up on a lot of unclear emotions. His baseless accusations left me completely unwilling to decipher his intentions, only fueling the anger rising within me. My heart had already turned cold. Just as I was about to retort to Daniel Miller, Ethan Page spoke first. "Oh, so you're the cheater, and now you assume everyone else is just like you?" "I came back because of a work transfer. As for tonight, let's just say I couldn't stand by and not help when I saw injustice." After speaking, he slid one hand into his coat pocket while the other firmly gripped my wrist. Let's go inside. From start to finish, he didn't spare Daniel Miller a single glance. Let go of me. I instinctively pulled my hand away. Just as I was about to step inside, Olivia Wilde stepped out. She glanced at Daniel Miller, then at me, frowning slightly. Emily Carter, you and Daniel Miller have already broken up. Why do you keep bothering him? Olivia Wilde had always been this confident, as if the world revolved around her. I let out a cold laugh. Finally unable to hold back, I turned around and looked at them. How can you be so shameless? Daniel Miller and I hadn't even broken up, yet you were already relentlessly pursuing him. We were about to get engaged, and you had the audacity to publicly celebrate your one-year anniversary with him on Valentine's Day. Now that Daniel Miller and I have broken up, you're questioning me? On what grounds? Do you think I'm as immoral as the two of you? Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde stared at me, stunned and speechless. Perhaps because I had always endured everything in silence, they assumed I would never fight back, growing bolder and more brazen over time. But now, with Ethan Page standing beside me, it felt as though his presence gradually gave me the courage to finally express all the emotions I had been suppressing. I suddenly recalled the time before the university entrance exams when Ethan Page and I attended the independent admissions test for University A. After the interview, I was feeling down, and a male student nearby mocked me, saying I definitely wouldn't pass. Ethan Page overheard and immediately looked up at him, saying, "Even if she doesn't pass, do you think you will? You're overestimating yourself." His words gave me the strength to fight back. Evan Bourne from Class 12A7, don't forget we were in the same class, back in 10th grade. You always ranked last in exams then, and now, 3 years later, it seems you're still at the bottom. Is that why you're hoping everyone else's interview results turn out poorly too? Evan Bourne's face turned pale. Ethan Page smiled and reached out to pat my head. You may seem like a soft target, but when you fight back, you know just where to strike. Snapping back from the memory, I no longer wanted to see the two of them. I stepped into the room, grabbed my coat from the rack, and started heading toward the door while putting it on. Sophia Watson hurried over and grabbed me, glancing at Ethan Page beside me with a smile. Ethan Page, I've had a bit too much to drink tonight. Could you take her home? Ethan Page nodded naturally. Sure. Thank you. Sophia Watson gently poked my back. Go on, Emily Carter, we'll meet again another day. The night was slightly chilly. After Sophia Watson left, I got into Ethan Page's car. He reached out to turn on the air conditioning, one hand on the steering wheel, and asked me, address? I sent him the address. Ethan Page opened the navigation and looked at me with a hint of suspicion. A bar? I nodded indifferently, gazing out the window, as if to celebrate my new life, to celebrate finally seeing them clearly. Ethan Page didn't ask further. He simply leaned over and pulled the seatbelt from my side. Buckle up. His soft hair brushed against my cheek, leaving a slightly ticklish sensation. A faint cedarwood scent lingered in the air. The moment Ethan Page lifted his head, our eyes met, and my face suddenly flushed. On the way, we barely spoke. When we arrived at the bar, Ethan Page followed behind me. I found a table in the corner and sat down. Ethan Page chose to sit across from me. Do you come here often? I scanned the QR code on the table and shook my head. This is my second time here. The first time I came here was because Sophia Watson brought me. Her boyfriend had cheated on her while she was away on a business trip. When Sophia Watson returned home, she found her boyfriend and another woman naked on the bed they had chosen together. Without saying a word, Sophia Watson threw them both out without giving them time to put on clothes. Her boyfriend and the other woman stood naked in the hallway until Sophia Watson threw their clothes out for them to put on before leaving. When Sophia Watson recounted this story, though she was laughing, tears kept streaming down her face. Sophia Watson and I have been best friends since childhood, as close as sisters. Every time I was bullied, Sophia Watson would step in to protect me. After being rejected by Ethan Page, I went through a dark time, suffering from anorexia and throwing up everything I ate. Sophia Watson would bring delicious food for me every day. When I couldn't eat, she would eat in front of me to spark my appetite. She ended up overeating and became an overweight girl. Thankfully, Sophia Watson has excellent self-control and quickly succeeded in losing weight. If not, I would have felt guilty for the rest of my life. That's why, whenever she needs me, I'm always there for her, just as she has always been there for me. Chapter 4. I never expected that after the breakup, I would come here with Ethan Page. Nowadays, many bars use QR codes for ordering. Since I'm not familiar with alcohol, I randomly picked a few drinks. I handed a glass to Ethan Page. Care for a drink? Ethan Page looked at me and shook his head. Can't drink and drive. Beautiful lady, let us drink with you. A blond man, with a long-haired dark-haired guy in his arms, walked past our table. Hearing Ethan Page's words, he sat down beside me. I glanced at him disdainfully and smiled faintly. Sorry, I don't drink with hooligans. The blond man stood up and grabbed my hand. What did you say? The lighting in the bar was dim, and I had been drinking, so everything felt hazy. Unable to clearly see their expressions, emboldened by the alcohol, I repeated, hooligan. As the blond man was about to hit me, Ethan Page firmly grabbed his wrist. Ethan Page had a bold and fearless personality. No one at school dared to mess with him. Previously, after an exam, I had offended Evan Bourne from class 12A7 because Ethan Page stood up for me. One evening after self-study, Evan Bourne and some outsiders blocked my path. I thought I was done for. When Evan Bourne was about to teach me a lesson, Ethan Page struck him with a baseball bat. Everyone was terrified. Ethan Page stepped forward, shielding me behind him. If you're brave, come at me. What's so great about picking on a girl? After speaking, Evan Bourne and his group surrounded Ethan Page. Facing multiple opponents alone, some of whom weren't really a challenge, Ethan Page stood his ground. Evan Bourne and the social group were no match for Ethan Page. They were defeated and left in humiliation. Ethan Page patted my head and said, "Go home." After saying that, he picked up the baseball bat and turned to leave. Ethan Page's deep, warm voice brought me back to reality. When a lady says no to drinking, you should respect her. That's the mark of a gentleman. Ethan Page twisted the blonde guy's arm behind his back, making him cry out in pain. I looked up at him. If he had accepted my confession back then, it wouldn't have been Daniel Miller accompanying me for 6 years, it would have been Ethan Page. Would the outcome now be different? I let out a cold laugh and drank large gulps of the alcohol on the table. Knowing my tolerance was low, I still wanted to drink until I passed out. That's enough, you've had too much. Let me go. I can still drink, I can still handle more. When I reached for the last glass of alcohol, Ethan Page suddenly grabbed it and downed it in one gulp. Seeing the glass snatched away, I lost control of my emotions immediately. Ethan Page, you bastard. Ethan Page adjusted his glasses, not angry, slid his phone into his pocket, raised an eyebrow at me, and then picked me up to leave. Since Ethan Page had also been drinking, he couldn't drive. He carried me to the roadside to call for a cab. Unexpectedly, when drunk, I became bolder. The moment he put me down, I stood firmly, placed my hands on my hips, and looked at him. My voice didn't tremble, but echoed loudly, Ethan Page, why did you receive my letter and not reply even once? Ethan Page frowned and looked at me. What letter? What happened after that, I couldn't remember at all. When I woke up, it was already the next morning. I swallowed hard, realizing that he and I were in a hotel room. Looking down, I noticed I had changed into a white shirt. After a few moments of hesitation, my memory of what happened before losing contact last night seemed completely blank. Ethan Page was sitting on the sofa, head down, scrolling through his phone. Hearing my movements, he looked up at me, as if he could read my thoughts. You were too drunk last night. I couldn't reach Sophia Watson, so I had no choice but to bring you here. The room manager helped you change your clothes. Oh. I nodded, cautiously asking, did I do anything inappropriate last night? When I get drunk, I tend to lose my memory, completely unaware of what I might have done. Emily Carter, is this how you thank someone who ensured your safety when you were drunk? Ethan Page suddenly stood up, walked toward me, and leaned down, looking me in the eye while pointing to his neck. Seeing the bite mark on his neck, I mustered all my courage and looked up at him. Sorry, I'll take responsibility. Ethan Page smiled faintly, straightened up, and slid his hands into his pockets. The clothes in the wardrobe are ones I bought last night. Change into them, and I'll take you home. It was only then that I noticed Ethan Page wasn't wearing the same outfit as yesterday. The black outfit he had on now made him look like a protagonist straight out of a comic book. His black shirt's collar was open, revealing a silver chain around his neck. The only thing that remained unchanged was his gold-rimmed glasses. On the way home, light snow fell outside the car window. The cold ground was wet, quickly blanketed by a thin layer of white. As we neared my house, I saw my mother and Sophia Watson waiting by the door from afar. Ethan Page stopped the car in front of my house and opened the door. I carefully stepped onto the ground and looked at them. Why are you both here? Sophia Watson heard you were coming home, so she ran over to tell me. We've been waiting here together, my mother grumbled, her tone full of complaints. You were gone all night without calling. Don't you worry about making me anxious? I turned to glance at Ethan Page. Mom, this is Ethan Page, my high school classmate and also Sophia Watson's. Ethan Page stood by the car and nodded politely at my mother. Hello, ma'am. Sophia Watson linked arms with my mother, as if she were her own daughter, and waved at Ethan Page. It's snowing, it's cold out here, come inside and have a cup of hot tea. My mother and Sophia Watson looked at Ethan Page as though trying to see through him. I thought he would refuse, but to my surprise, he agreed casually, all right. Ethan Page sat on the sofa while I was pulled into the room by Sophia Watson. Quick, spill it. You and Ethan Page last night. I hung my bag on the door and took off my coat, placing it on the bed. There's nothing between us. And what did you and my mom talk about? I just mentioned that your first love was Ethan Page, and back then, you even developed an eating disorder because of him. Sophia Watson lay sideways on my bed, fiddling with her phone, her eyes full of amusement as she looked at me. From the moment we got out of the car, seeing the way my mother and Sophia Watson looked at Ethan Page, I knew what they were thinking. Sophia Watson showered Ethan Page with compliments and even criticized Daniel Miller a few times. I smiled. Sophia Watson, I'm fine. Sophia Watson is the most important person to me, aside from my mother. Really, I'm okay. Because I realized that after last night, the lingering feelings of the past 6 years for Daniel Miller, the pain and confusion over why he cheated on me with Olivia Wilde, were gradually fading. In truth, my feelings for him seemed to be more of a habit than love. Now that Ethan Page has returned, the emotions I had deliberately buried for the past 6 years have surged back intensely. When Sophia Watson and I returned to the living room, Ethan Page had already left. I had no idea what he and my mother talked about, but since he walked out of my house, we haven't seen each other again. At the company's year-end party, I initially didn't want to attend. However, my boss mentioned there would be an important announcement, and all employees were required to be present. Reluctantly, I adjusted my plans to return home later. I've never been fond of heavy makeup, but under Sophia Watson's strong insistence, I ended up wearing the red dress she had prepared for me. Perhaps the dress was too eye-catching. Just as I stepped into the venue, I attracted numerous stares. Colleagues who had never seen me dressed like this came over to greet me. Even Director Johnson approached, shaking my hand with a friendly tone. Emily Carter, you look stunning tonight. His words and actions drew even more attention toward me. Among the gazes, one pair of eyes felt particularly intense. Yet, when I looked around, I couldn't identify who it was. The old year has passed, and the new year is upon us. I'm Eddie Kingston, your MC for tonight. It's a pleasure to host the company's year-end party. It seems this year has been another fruitful one. Let's welcome our big boss, Director Johnson, to the stage to deliver the annual summary. The event officially began as Eddie Kingston, the professional MC hired by the company as usual, took the stage. "Emily Carter, how do I look?" Director Johnson adjusted his clothing and asked me gently. I looked at him and nodded. Honestly, how he looked didn't concern me. "Good evening, everyone. This year has indeed been a prosperous one, but this will also be the last time I address you in this capacity. After tonight, the Johnson name will no longer be associated with this company." What does Director Johnson mean? Is the company about to shut down? That can't be. Even though this year's revenue wasn't as high as previous years, it's not enough to dissolve the company. I stared at Director Johnson on the stage, filled with the same confusion as my colleagues. Was this the major announcement he mentioned? The murmurs among the employees grew louder. "Everyone, please quiet down." Director Johnson stepped forward. "Our company is neither dissolving nor going bankrupt." Hearing this, the room fell silent. Let's give a round of applause to welcome my new partner to the stage. Quade, the sound of applause echoed throughout the hall. Ethan Page? Why is he here? While I was still trying to figure out what was going on, Ethan Page stepped onto the center stage. "Hello everyone, I am Ethan Page. Many thanks to Director Johnson for the invitation. Today, I am attending the company's year-end party as a guest. However, starting next year, I will become one of you and join you in celebrating the year-end parties." Everyone looked at Ethan Page, whispering among themselves. Clap clap. After Ethan Page finished speaking, the hall erupted in enthusiastic applause, with some even standing up to applaud. I sat at the farthest corner table, watching Ethan Page on stage. Ethan Page has officially invested in our company, becoming the largest shareholder and taking on the position of General Manager and Chief Executive Officer. Director Johnson smiled, placing a hand on Ethan Page's shoulder, revealing his perfectly aligned white teeth. "Thank you." Clap clap. After Ethan Page spoke again, another round of applause filled the room as he stepped down from the stage amid the clapping. Director Johnson alone had already captivated the female colleagues, and now with Ethan Page, it's certain the young women in the office will no longer be able to focus on their work. I don't like parties like this. Before the party even ended, I left early. The night wind was a bit strong. As soon as I stepped out of the hotel, a black Maybach stopped in front of me. Ethan Page rolled down the window, looked at me standing in the wind, and said, "Get in." I didn't know when Ethan Page had left the party, but I was certain the passionate gaze earlier in the hall was his. Looking at Ethan Page, I didn't refuse. Chapter 5. After getting in the car, Ethan Page drove me to an outdoor restaurant. It was my favorite restaurant, and as soon as we entered, we saw two familiar figures approaching. It was Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde. They walked arm in arm toward us. The moment Olivia Wilde saw me, her smile instantly disappeared. She raised her head to observe Daniel Miller's expression. Daniel Miller looked at me and Ethan Page, his face turning extremely unpleasant, his gaze toward me filled with confusion. "Emily Carter, what a coincidence," Olivia Wilde said, clutching Daniel Miller's arm tightly, smiling as she looked at us. Ethan Page's eyes swept past them without lingering for even a second. He took my hand and walked away. His demeanor made it seem as though the two people in front of us were merely passers-by, unworthy of even a glance. I followed him into the restaurant. Neither Ethan Page nor I looked back at them once. While we were eating, a violinist approached and performed a romantic melody beside us. Ethan Page held my hand tightly, listening to the enchanting tunes. "Why did you invest in our company?" I looked at him and nodded. "Actually, I studied international trade in Beijing and once had dealings with Director Johnson from your company. Later, I discovered that due to Director Johnson's poor management, your company was heavily in debt. I decided to invest because I saw potential in the company, and I also needed a job as I returned to develop my career here." Ethan Page held his wine glass and took a sip. Don't misunderstand, I didn't invest because of you. I only found out today that you work there. I nodded without saying anything, my mood sinking instantly. Was it necessary to deny it so quickly? Even if it was because of me, so what? Emily Carter. I looked up at him. Even though I didn't invest in the company because of you, my decision to return here was entirely because of you. Ethan Page had never expressed his feelings to anyone before, and hearing him say this today truly made me happy. After dinner, Ethan Page drove me home. He walked to the car door and opened it for me. Standing in front of him, I tiptoed and stole a quick kiss. The kiss was brief, like a dragonfly skimming the surface of water. Ethan Page wrapped his arms tightly around my waist, pulling me into his embrace, and leaned down to kiss me. The kiss was long and deep, and we were both lost in each other's world. It reminded me of the final scene in a movie, where the female lead stood on tiptoes, her hands wrapped around the male lead's neck, kissing him on the lips. When I went upstairs and looked out the window, Ethan Page was still standing there. Under the streetlight, he pulled a cigarette from his pocket. In the descending darkness, the cigarette's glow flickered faintly. Emily. Turning around, I saw my mother standing behind me, looking down at Ethan with a gentle smile. She asked cautiously, "Aren't you going to the year-end party today? Why did you come back with Ethan Page?" "He's invested in my company. He's now the largest shareholder." I glanced at Ethan Page below as he extinguished his cigarette and got into his car to leave. My mother hugged me, letting out a relieved sigh. "So, you'll get to see each other every day from now on." Watching Ethan's car disappear into the distance, I nodded. "That's good. You and Ethan Page should be together. He's a good man, and he genuinely cares about you." "Honestly, I think he's far more reliable than Daniel Miller." I patiently listened to my mother's warm advice, unable to stop myself from recalling the past. During the time when the engagement was called off, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, images of him and Olivia Wilde being intimate would flash in my mind. During that period, my mother stayed by my side, helping me through it little by little. After my parents divorced, I once asked my mother why she chose to stay with my father before, but then decided to leave. Loving someone means cooking delicious meals every day, waiting for them to come home and eat with you. But as time goes by, you realize the person you've been waiting for is happy with another woman. Everything you've done feels meaningless. Sometimes, you need to know when to stop so you don't hurt yourself too much. She didn't divorce earlier, because I was still young. Now that I'm grown, she can finally live for herself. It wasn't until I broke up with Daniel Miller that I truly understood what my mother meant. My mother was a full-time housewife. Before she and my father divorced, she would prepare a table full of dishes every day, waiting for him to come home and eat with us. My father's company was just starting to take off, and his work was very busy, but he still came home on time every day to have dinner with us. The three of us were a happy family. Until I entered high school, I began to notice that my father came home less and less. Yet my mother still cooked his favorite dishes every day, waiting for him to return. Perhaps people truly do change. By my final year of high school, their arguments had become more frequent. To avoid affecting my studies, my father moved out. After my college entrance exams, they quickly divorced. When we were packing up the house, I once asked my mother, "Mom, why did you have to divorce Dad?" She said, "When you've prepared a table full of his favorite dishes, and he still wants to come home to eat, then he's someone worth waiting for. But if he doesn't want to come back, then don't wait anymore. Make the dishes you like instead, because no matter how long you wait, he won't come back to eat with you. Why make yourself suffer by waiting for someone who isn't worth it?" It's the same with Daniel Miller and me. After the holiday ended, I returned to work at the company. The HR department informed me of a personnel adjustment, assigning me to be Ethan Page's assistant. Knock, knock. I stood outside the door and knocked. "Come in." When I pushed the door open and entered, I saw a familiar figure working diligently. He didn't look at me, completely absorbed in his work. From now on, address me as President Liu in the company. He was still as cold and indifferent as ever, sometimes making me truly doubt whether he had ever been sincere toward me. President Liu, this is the document Sister Leni asked me to deliver to you. I placed the document on his desk, suppressing the frustration in my heart, and looked at him. If there's nothing else, I'll excuse myself. Ethan Page stood up, leaned on the desk, and inclined forward to look at me. I don't want you to feel wronged at work because of me. Meeting you today makes me very happy. Don't take what I just said to heart. He was always the type to strike first and then console later. Make me a cup of coffee, will you? Ethan Page smiled faintly and sat back in his chair. When I entered the break room, I noticed the women in the office gossiping about Ethan Page. Good morning, Miss Emily Carter. I held Ethan Page's personal mug and smiled at them. Miss Emily Carter, is that coffee for Mr. Page? I nodded. You're so lucky, Miss Emily Carter. Exactly, I wish I could make coffee for him too. If he made coffee for me, I'd agree to anything immediately. But alas. Make coffee for him? What are these kids thinking nowadays? It's just making a cup of coffee, nothing more. Why turn it into such a big deal? I sighed, shaking my head. Here. I handed the mug to one of them. Really? I smiled and nodded. Now that he's back, we're working together at the same company. Ethan Page rents a house right across from mine. Living so close to each other, frequent interactions naturally became more common. When Ethan Page first arrived, he wasn't familiar with many tasks. At first, I stayed late to work overtime with him voluntarily. Eventually, this turned into an unspoken understanding between us. After working overtime, we often had dinner together at a nearby restaurant and walked home together. That afternoon, I wasn't feeling well, so I left work early. Ethan Page, with his new project nearing its deadline, stayed behind to work overtime alone. Around 11 p.m., it started pouring rain. I remembered he had gone out without an umbrella, and his car had been sent for maintenance a few days ago and wasn't back yet. Despite feeling unwell, I looked out at the heavy rain and finally decided to get dressed and go pick him up. When I arrived at the company building, it was already midnight. Ethan Page was standing in the cold rain, looking a bit awkward. I drove up to him, rolled down the window, and teased, "Hey there, need a ride?" He frowned, his expression tinged with anger. You're sick. Why aren't you resting at home? What are you doing here? I opened the car door, smiling at him. Well, I was hungry and wanted someone to eat with. Ethan Page got into the car, took off his coat, and draped it over me. Only then did I realize I had rushed out wearing just a thin jacket. On the way home, Ethan Page held my cold hands tightly, rubbing them to warm them up. If you're not feeling well, don't come to pick me up next time. He turned to look at me and said, Emily Carter, from now on, I'll be your driver. Hearing those words, I suddenly remembered last year. That day, I hadn't been feeling well all day. After work, I called Daniel Miller, hoping he could come pick me up. But instead, he drove to pick up Olivia Wilde, leaving me to call for a ride on my own. Every time my period comes, the pain is unbearable, and there was even a time I fainted from it. Chapter 6. I tried to endure the pain as I got into the car. The driver noticed my pale face and nearly took me to the hospital. Finally, Sophia Watson came to pick me up and took me home, even cooking a meal for me. After eating, I saw a social media post from Olivia Wilde. Although I no longer have feelings for Daniel Miller, the sadness I felt at that time was real. Ethan Page had already ordered a late-night dinner while we were still in the car. As soon as the driver pulled into the apartment complex, the delivery person called him. Ethan Page grabbed the takeout and went upstairs with me. It was his first time visiting my place, a simple one-bedroom apartment that I kept clean and tidy. He unpacked the food carefully and set it on the table. By chance, I noticed a note on the order receipt: "Dear Chef, my girlfriend isn't feeling well. Please help prepare a bowl of ginger tea with brown sugar. Thank you so much, I'll owe you one." I looked at Ethan Page in front of me and smiled. He placed the bowl of ginger tea with brown sugar in front of me. "What are you smiling about? Is there something on my face?" I shook my head and replied with a laugh, "No, you're just as handsome as always." Every time I was in so much pain that I couldn't stand up, I would lie slumped over my desk all day. For some reason, Ethan Page always seemed to have a heating pad and ginger tea with brown sugar on hand. Whenever he saw me lying on the desk, he immediately knew I wasn't feeling well. I once asked him why he always had those things. He placed them on my desk and replied casually, "The homeroom teacher asked me to bring them to you." The result was that throughout high school, he remained the same. At that time, I foolishly said to him, "Sometimes I really wonder if you have Doraemon's magic pocket." It wasn't until now that I realized how slow-witted I had been back then. Since that day, I discovered there were many hand warmers in his office. I could feel the distance between him and me growing closer. The feelings we had left behind in the flow of time were gradually rediscovered, and even during moments of closeness, they became more vivid. Ethan Page had a charm that captivated me and a meticulous attention to detail. Sometimes, my mom would call and always say, "You and Ethan Page make such a great pair." But, every time I thought about the confession letter that never received a reply, I lost the courage to confess to Ethan Page again. Through the glass window, I watched Ethan Page working diligently, and an unfamiliar call interrupted my thoughts. "Hello, is this Emily Carter?" "This is Lucas Brown." How could I forget him? Lucas Brown was a member of our high school basketball team and used to live in the same neighborhood as me. After graduating from high school, my parents divorced, and I moved with my mom back to my maternal hometown. Ethan Page got into Peking University and became very busy, so we didn't meet. He and Ethan Page both studied in Beijing, so I asked him to deliver the letter to Ethan Page. Afterward, I moved houses, didn't receive any calls from Lucas Brown, and we didn't see each other again. "Daniel Miller is drunk at the bar, and he keeps calling your name. Could you come over for a bit?" I looked up at the clock on the wall. It was already 11 p.m. "Sorry, I'm about to go to bed." I thought he would take the hint, but instead, he said, "Emily Carter, you should come here for a moment. About the letter I was supposed to deliver to Ethan Page, there's something I need to tell you." After all these years, this was the first time he called to bring this up. If there's something to say, just say it over the phone. Perhaps I didn't want to see Daniel Miller again, or maybe I just didn't want to revisit the past, so I refused to meet him. "Emily Carter, 7 years ago, Ethan Page gave me something to pass on to you." Something from Ethan Page? Why is he only bringing it up now? Sensing my silence, Lucas Brown seemed uneasy. "Emily Carter, about what happened 7 years ago, I owe you an explanation. Can you meet me just this once?" "Emily Carter. Carter. I can't live without you." Daniel Miller's voice came through the phone. He was drunk. "Send me the address." With that, I hung up. I didn't bother with makeup, just threw on something comfortable and headed out. In the bar's warm lighting, I quickly walked to the corner table and tapped lightly on its surface. Daniel Miller was drunk. He lifted his hazy eyes to look at me. "You're still with Ethan Page, aren't you?" I simply gave him a glance. "What does that have to do with you?" "Daniel Miller, you were the one who cheated first. You have no right to question me. But you shouldn't have chosen Ethan Page either. At first, you confessed to him, and he didn't respond. That alone proves he doesn't like you." I froze, grabbing Daniel Miller by the collar, staring straight into his eyes, and said word by word, "How do you know I confessed to him and that he didn't respond?" Lucas Brown pulled me aside, his face filled with guilt. He took out a carefully wrapped gift box from his pocket. "This is the gift Ethan Page asked me to give you 7 years ago." Even after 7 years, the gift remained unopened, still as exquisite as ever. A love letter? This was the gift Ethan Page sent me 7 years ago. I'm sorry, Emily Carter. Back then, when you asked me to deliver your letter, I didn't. Lucas Brown glanced at a drunken Daniel Miller. At the time, Daniel Miller was my best friend. He liked you and knew you had feelings for Ethan Page, so he told me to hold on to the letter. I had only known Lucas Brown and Ethan Page as roommates. I never imagined he was so close to Daniel Miller. Did you deliver it? Lucas Brown shook his head. No, I just promised him I wouldn't let the letter get out. Knowing Daniel Miller liked me, Lucas had hidden both my letter and Ethan Page's love letter to maintain their friendship. I let out a cold laugh, looking at him. Where is my letter? Lucas Brown lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. A few days ago, I delivered the letter to Ethan Page. 7 years later, the letter I wrote to Ethan Page finally reached him, and the gift from Ethan Page finally reached me. I'm sorry. Lucas Brown stood up, sincerely apologizing to me. This apology came 7 years too late, but I wouldn't accept it. Holding the gift from Ethan Page, I unconsciously walked to the front of Ethan Page's house. From the window, he saw me and came downstairs. He looked at the book in my hand, understanding everything immediately. Emily Carter, now that you've received this book, can you give me an answer? He pulled me into his arms. I felt his tight embrace, the night breeze carrying faint sounds around us. I could clearly hear Ethan Page's heartbeat and my own. This feeling was even more profound than it had been 6 years ago. After that, Daniel Miller came to see me once. Ethan Page had to meet a client, so after working overtime, I went home alone. That night, it rained lightly. I planned to walk home in the drizzle, but from afar, I saw a figure holding an umbrella. Ethan Page? As I got closer, I realized it was Daniel Miller. He and Olivia Wilde were the last people I wanted to see. Just as I was about to walk past him, he grabbed my wrist tightly. Do you really want to be with Ethan Page? I turned back to look at him. No matter how much I struggled, I couldn't break free from his grip. My wrist hurt under his hold. Who I'm with is none of your business. He gave me a cold smile. If it weren't for you sitting by the basketball court watching me, or rushing over to help treat my injuries when I got hurt, would I have misunderstood that you liked me? Now you're with Ethan Page. So, what was the meaning of everything between us? During the years we spent together, you told me countless times that you liked me. Were all of those lies? I suddenly realized that he and Olivia Wilde were truly a perfect match. One was arrogant and self-centered, the other was persistent and relentless. The important thing was that neither of them had any sense of morality, never seeing their own faults. I sat by the basketball court to watch Ethan Page. I helped you treat your injuries, because I was the class president in charge of student affairs. The one I liked was him. After graduation, I even planned to confess to him. I gritted my teeth, trying to suppress the trembling in my voice. You stole the time I could have spent with Ethan Page, Daniel Miller. Now that you know the truth, all I feel is disgust. I never thought your so-called love could be this cheap. Emily Carter. Before he could react, Daniel Miller was punched squarely in the face by Ethan Page. He staggered and fell to the ground, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. I looked at Daniel Miller and pulled Ethan Page's hand. Aren't you supposed to meet a client? I was worried about you, so I came back early. Ethan Page gently stroked my face, his gaze tender. Picking up what others discard makes you this happy, Ethan Page? Daniel Miller wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, stood up, and looked at us. Ethan Page sneered coldly and stared at Daniel Miller. Daniel Miller, remember this, Emily Carter has never been anyone's possession. She saw right through you. Thinking about how I once felt heartbroken over someone so despicable, I felt. Getting into the car, I saw Daniel Miller standing in the rain through the rearview mirror, watching us. Ethan Page held my hand. Actually, I went to the class reunion last year. I looked at him in surprise. I arrived late that day. By the time I got there, everyone had already been drinking quite a bit. I stood at the door for a long time. You and Daniel Miller walked right past me without noticing. He spoke and smiled faintly. At that moment, I heard Daniel Miller saying you two would get engaged the following year. I saw how happy you looked at him, as if your eyes only held him. In the end, I didn't go in. I wasn't good at drinking much, but that day I had too much, because I was happy. Daniel Miller helped me in and out. Thinking back, I felt bitterness and discomfort in my heart. Before I could say anything, Ethan Page suddenly spoke. Emily Carter, if I had known Daniel Miller was like this, I would never have let you go to him. At a red light, Ethan Page stopped the car, turned to look at me, his gaze serious, his voice deep. 6 years have passed. Do you still want to love me? I looked at him. And for some reason, tears streamed down my face. I nodded earnestly. Ethan Page wiped my tears away, held my head, and kissed me on the lips. My mother was overjoyed, muttering about inviting Ethan Page over for dinner. Hearing this, Ethan Page grew even more excited. He smiled and said, "One day, I'll come over and have dinner with her myself." Then, I met Sophia Watson and shared the story with her as well. After hearing it, she was even more excited than my mother, throwing a few insults at Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde before endlessly praising Ethan Page. I told you, you and Ethan Page are the perfect match. Let Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde live their happily ever after together. I glanced at Sophia Watson and smirked faintly. Their happiness won't last long. Not long after, Sophia Watson came running to tell me that Olivia Wilde's father had been dismissed from his position as dean due to embezzlement and bribery, which also forced Olivia Wilde to quit her job. Daniel Miller, who had initially thought Olivia could help him secure the associate professor position, ended up losing his chance at the role because of their relationship. After Daniel Miller and Olivia Wilde got together, I had someone investigate everything about Olivia Wilde's family and her father. Could it be called an unintended victory? I received an anonymous letter containing evidence of Olivia Wilde's father's embezzlement and bribery. If it weren't for how outrageous the two of them were, I might have let it slide out of old schoolmate camaraderie. But he had gone to such lengths, causing Ethan Page and me to lose 6 years, and after cheating, he even tried every possible way to make my life miserable. How could I sit back and let them live happily? I told you Daniel Miller chose Olivia Wilde because of her father. Once her father's embezzlement was exposed, Daniel Miller immediately broke up with her, thinking that breaking up would help him get the associate professor position. But in the end, that title went to someone else. Serves him right, I said. After sharing the news, Sophia Watson sighed, "With your personality, I thought this would end there. I didn't expect you to strike back so fiercely. You're truly strong. Tell me honestly, is this Ethan Page's influence on you?" I thought for a moment. Maybe so. After Sophia Watson left, I went to the restaurant downstairs and ordered a few dishes Ethan Page liked. The company's new project had just started, and Ethan Page had been working overtime lately. As his personal secretary, of course, I had to be by his side. When I arrived at the company, I realized that everyone on Ethan Page's project team was working overtime. Carrying the lunchbox, I smiled awkwardly. Is everyone working overtime? Emily Carter, we're trying to catch up with the project deadline. Sis, you came to visit us, didn't you? What delicious food did you bring? You came at the perfect time, we're starving. I stood there, watching them. One person said something, then another chimed in, leaving me unsure of how to respond. What delicious food did you bring? A girl stepped closer, just about to take the lunchbox from my hands, when Ethan Page appeared out of nowhere. This is a love-packed lunchbox made especially for me. If you all are hungry, order something outside, it's on me. All eyes turned toward Ethan Page and me. My face flushed red like a ripe tomato as I tried to smile, masking my embarrassment. She's my girlfriend. She came here today to bring me lunch. Ethan Page walked over to me and held my hand. Everyone froze, exchanging shocked glances, unsure of how to react. I won. I told you they were a couple. I think I also bet on them being together. Henry Wilson, you lost. Pay up. What kind of game is this? Ethan Page chuckled. All of you bet on me and Emily Carter. Tomorrow, food and karaoke are on me. Long live CEO Ethan. Long live Sister Emily Carter. For some reason, tears welled up in my eyes. I lowered my head, unable to look at Ethan Page. Perhaps this was what it felt like to cry from being overwhelmed with emotion. Emily Carter, we've already missed 6 years. I don't want us to miss the rest of our lives. I closed my eyes and hugged him tightly. I feel the same way.